Hello everyone. Today I thought I would do a video about the Leannán Sidhe. I don't think I've done an entire video just about this. And it is an interesting subject, and it's one that people will sometimes have questions about. It's also a subject that there is a lot of confusion about, mostly because of William Butler Yeats. So, when we talk about the Leannán Sidhe in Irish, and also as far as I know in Scottish Gaelic, literally means fairy lover or fairy sweetheart. And this is not referring to a human who has affection for fairy. This is referring to a fairy who is the lover or sweetheart of a human. Kind of like Banshee means fairy woman, Leannán Sidhe means fairy lover, a fairy who is a lover, if you can follow all that. So, when we look at the Leannán Sidhe in folklore, which is the older accounts, the older material, we do find references to them back into Irish mythology, and we find them as well into the 18th and early to mid 19th century. And when we see them in these instances, they are referring generally to any fairy being, any type of fairy, member of the Aeschi, Kelpies, pretty much anything you can name that has a humanoid form that could potentially be the lover of a human being. Male or female, they are not gendered. There's at least one reference by Gareth O'Crullach in his book, The Cailleach, which talks about a male Leannán Sidhe who was known or associated with a Banfasa, a wise woman in Ireland. We also have many accounts of male Kelpies who would fit into this general category, with lovers of human women, often have children with them. So we have these examples. We also have, of course, examples of female Leannán Sidhe, female fairies who take human lovers. So it's kind of across the board, if you will. There's no gender attached to it. We do generally see heterosexual couples when this is being discussed, but that is sort of typical of the material we're looking at anyway. It does tend to be a little heteronormative. Take that as you will. I would certainly not rule out other possibilities, but what we do have in the folklore tends to go in that direction. So when we're talking about classic folkloric Leannán Sidhe, what we find are any fairy being who takes a human as a lover, and often also will help teach or instruct or guide that human. Not so much like as an advisor necessarily, but they certainly will give them assistance. The case that I mentioned from the book, The Cailleach, Book of the Cailleach, in that example, he seemed to be helping to teach her about herbs, and she used that herbal knowledge then to her own benefit and to help the community. So we sort of see them in this dual role, if you will, not just as the lover of that individual person, but often also acting to guide or teach or instruct the person. Not always. There are, of course, also examples where it does seem to be just a more physical sort of relationship. We have, for example, in Scotland, the song Bun Uránach. Sorry, I might have mispronounced that slightly because my Scottish Gaelic is a little rough, but Bun Uránach, pulling bracken, basically, is what it means. So the fairy love song, it's also called sometimes, which is a song about a human man who loves a woman of the Sidhe, a female fairy. And in that song, that example, the lyrics, there doesn't seem to imply anything beyond just that they loved each other and they had that sort of a relationship. So this is one sort of Leannán Sidhe that we find in folklore. And again, this goes back at least 1,000 years. The goddess, fairy queen, however you want to describe her, Eva was said to be the Leannán Sidhe of the basically the head of the Dalcas, who then became sort of the head of the O'Brien family, which is why she sort of watches over them. She's said to be the Banshee of that family because of this connection that she supposedly had. Some people say it was to Brian Boru himself. Some people say it was to one of his sons. But either way, she was said to be a Leannán Sidhe to one of them, and subsequently then to follow the family. We see the same thing with the mythology of Anya, who was said to be the Leannán Sidhe of one of the Earls of Fitzgerald. And again, in this sense, just a fairy lover, a fairy who was a lover of someone in that family, and then subsequently followed and sort of acted in a protective role to the descendants of that family. So that is one type of Leannán Sidhe. The second type we have, and remember at the beginning I blamed Yeats, is because effectively of Yeats. So W.B. Yeats, when he was recording the material that he referred to as folklore, or sort of categorized as folklore, was doing so in a time period when folklore was much more flexible. It was not what we would consider it today. It did not have a strong academic basis. There wasn't a big emphasis on making sure you were recording the actual folk beliefs and folk stories of a community. It tended to be a lot of the personal opinions and thoughts of the person recording it, and sometimes even outright fiction. The person who was recording it would sort of embellish and embroider and add, and sometimes just make things up. Correcting material, if you will. Not that it needed correcting, but that was sort of their viewpoint. And these were usually folklorists who, obviously at the very beginning of the idea of folklorists, were people who were coming from a very educated class, often a very different social class from the people whose beliefs they were recording. So there's a lot of problematic issues. I could probably do an entire video just on why we have issues with Victorian folklorists. But Yeats, in the middle of all of that, recorded quite a bit of Irish material, a lot of which is just taken very much on face value as Irish folklore, but a lot of it really can't be backed up or found outside of Yeats' writing. So when you research the Leannán Sidhe, and you research it particularly in Irish language sources, you do not find anything similar to what Yeats talks about. And what Yeats gives us is the Leannán Sidhe as sort of the poet's dark muse. And as a very vampiric sort of being, specifically female, because of course, and one that would come to a poet and sort of offer him inspiration and a short but brilliant life in exchange for his life force. And Yeats also has this whole bizarre and slightly misguided thing about how when the Leannán Sidhe approached an artist or a poet, if the artist or the poet could refuse her and say no, instead of her being sort of in control of his life until she killed him, he would actually be the one who was in control of her, and she would then become subservient to him. I have a couple theories why that all got included in there. It's definitely not traditional folklore. Most likely is a blend of Yeats' own esoteric studies, work with the Golden Dawn, that sort of thing, and his opinions, potentially about women, but definitely about these sort of beings in folklore. And it was possibly also on a deeper level just an allegory to a poet or an artist's approach to poetry or art. You know, if you let your muse control you, you're going to burn out and die young. If you can control the muse, then you'll have more success and a longer career, and it may not utterly destroy you. So we kind of see Yeats creating this concept of the Leannán Sidhe as this dangerous, dark, yet surprisingly inspirational creature, female, that would come specifically to male poets and artists. And that idea from Yeats has really taken off and become very widespread and very popular. Even though, as I said, you really don't find this outside of specifically Yeats. I have never yet found a single Irish language source, folkloric source, that discusses these beings in the terms that Yeats uses. What you find in the older folklore, as I said, is the term is used in a very straightforward manner. It just means a fairy that is the lover of a human. Literally, a fairy lover. So, that is a fairly quick discussion of the Leannán Sidhe. Hope that helps clear some things up. You will occasionally run across the term in modern fiction, particularly urban fantasy. It's still fairly obscure, but you do see it. Usually horribly misused. Either the person using it in the urban fantasy misunderstands it and thinks that it's a human, it's a term for humans who are in love with or the lover of a fairy, which it's the reverse of that. Or you'll see sort of Yeats' idea of the dark vampiric poet's muse, fairy, taken to an extreme where the being is then described either literally as a vampire or sort of a caricature of what Yeats had put forward, which is already kind of a caricature to start with. So just some things to keep in mind. It's also important to know all of this because if you are reading or looking into folklore and you run across references to the Leannán Sidhe, you do need to be aware that the older references especially will just be talking about it in this very direct Leannán Sidhe as the fairy lover sense, and not in the more modernly popular version that Yeats has put forward. So 2 versions of the Leannán Sidhe: traditional folkloric, simple and straightforward, or the Yeats version, which is the poet's dark vampiric muse. That kind of sums it all up. If anyone has any questions about Leannán Sidhe, please feel free to post them in the comments and I will try to get to them. But I think that covers all of the important bits. So, everyone have a nice day. I know this is a shockingly short video for me. I will try to get back again soon and make some more content for you all.